This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. Tonight in our national program, we bring you a panel discussion entitled The Art of Poetry. The panelists are Miss Sukrita Paul Kumar, well-known poet, writer and academician; Miss Paramita Satpathy, administrator, poet and Sahitya Academy awardee; Mr. Ravi Singh, acclaimed publisher; and Renuka Narayanan, writer and columnist who initiates and moderates the discussion.
Good evening and welcome to the National Program of Talks. Tonight we're going to talk about the state of poetry in modern India, and we're very pleased to have with us three very special guests. Ravi Singh, an acclaimed publisher; Sukrita Paul Kumar, who wears many hats with aplomb, including being a writer, a painter, an academician, and a poet; and Paramita Satpathy, who is a revenue service officer and an acclaimed and awarded poet. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to begin this discussion by asking Ravi Singh, as a publisher, to share his insights on the general state of poetry in modern India today.
Well, to begin with, my familiarity is with poetry and other writing in English, so that's my experience, so I'm speaking from that. There is a lot of poetry being written, but there's very, very little that can be successfully sold. It's very difficult to publish poetry by successfully I mean in terms of sales. So it is a challenge, both for poets themselves and for publishers. Now, this isn't to say that things were very different earlier. Poetry was always very difficult to sell. But even if there wasn't direct state patronage, let's say, or subsidies, there were academic publishers who were able to publish works by, let's say, Nissim Ezekiel, K.K. Daruwala, Eunice D'Souza, so many others. And that they were able to do, and they were rather handsome editions in hardcover, etc., was because university departments, libraries, even if, government libraries, etc., bought, and that's why they sold these. Now, all of that has gone away. So that makes it very, very difficult. You're relying really on the market, the general market.
Is there a market at all for poetry in English today? Because I seem to remember just one book from the 70s, maybe, New Writing in India, or New Poetry in India, edited by Nissim Ezekiel. And that was the only thing that anybody ever had to look at.
Well, no, I don't specifically want to talk about, publishing houses and name them, but there were, in fact, a lot of the publishing that I'm saying, academic publishers here, university versus presses, they were doing it. Most recently, there's been a doorstopper of a book which has been published by a trade publisher, an English-language trade publisher, put together by G. Tile. But of course, it's not, to my mind, is not what is going to help create a climate for poetry, because that is a kind of designer publishing. I'm sure this will displease many people who've done it, but because it's, it's very high priced.
How much is it?
I don't even remember. I know that I, who wouldn't even think twice about spending a decent amount on buying books, even I kind of looked at it and I said, no, who is this for? No, who is this for? So anyway, putting that aside, but there are, of course, many names there, new ones, and it's wonderful that they're included, but a lot of it is the usual names, etc. So no, that's not the kind of publishing which will sustain poetry. There have to be affordable books published frequently. We are among the few publishers who still publish poetry. But honestly, we're able to do that because in many cases, there's somebody or the other who gives us a small grant. I personally have, also put in some money in doing few books. But, because they're friends and they also donate with small money. And sometimes there is a commitment from a certain number of people that they will buy these, this many copies, so you're able to do that. So you have to think imaginatively and do these things.
Out of the last 2 or 3 years, how many books of poetry in English would you, as a publisher, say, can recall, are out in the market? We
mustn't forget that there are some small publishers, sometimes just an individual.
I see.
Brave ones. I think, it should be okay to name them, like Copper Coin is one, Red River, and Hawakal. They're doing a lot of good work. So it's interesting because it isn't the big publishers. The big publishers come in after the smaller publishers have sort of created names in a bit of a climate, and then they come in and do that.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to arrive at. What is it like on the ground?
Just to give you an example, we consistently do about 3 to 4 books of poetry every year, at least 3 to 4. As I said,
Oh, that's a lot.
well, as I said, there are grants, etc., which help us do that, and a couple which we do on our own. So it isn't impossible to do. It's not easy, but
I should like to ask Sukrita how you were brave enough to get into this neglected genre.
Well, I don't think one could help doing it. Like, one had to do it. One had to write. Now, it's not as if I was getting my bread and butter from, I'm a leave aside butter. There was no question of even bread from writing poetry. But I would like to say that in my case, whether it's writing poetry or doing my academic work or translation, everything seems to come together somewhere. So while I'm writing a lot of poetry, particularly these days, but there is also, as Ravi, you mentioned about these small publishers who are getting bigger and bigger over time because they've been really brave in continuously publishing poetry. But I would like to mention this point in the context of my own self and Vinita Agrawal. We've got together and we are also publishing, the second volume's just come out. We call it the Yearbook of Indian Poetry in English. And you won't believe it, every year, and both the years, there are about 700 to 800 poems at least, which get submitted to us, and then we do the shortlisting, and we have a committee of about 8 young and old poets who do the selection. We try to be as objective as possible. It's anonymous, and these books are coming out, and I believe they are selling reasonably well. Your book is also, in a way, archiving selected material.
No, it's wonderful that you get 700 to 800
submissions. Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting news.
Yeah. So, as far as your original question is concerned, why did I start writing poetry? It was very long ago, which I did, and strangely, my first poem was in Hindi. And surprisingly to me also, because I lost my Hindi after that, because I was in Kenya, born and brought up in Kenya. And my father, who was a writer in Urdu, he's the one who was very, very keen that I should know Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, living abroad where these languages were not taught in school. But at the same time, it's very interesting to see that while I write in English, as somebody like Guldasa put it, behind my English, obviously, there's a lot of Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi culture that is operative. And so in English, my expression gets negotiated with these cultures. And when he translated my poems into Hindustani, he said that I'm actually bringing your poems at home. Because when I'm translating, actually these poems should have been written in Hindi and Urdu and not in English. So I'm bringing them home by doing it, though I don't agree with that.
Charming thing to happen.
Yes.
Would you favor us with a glimpse of your poetry?
Yes, sure. I would do that because this is something that I was engaged with very intensely. I was working with homeless people. I will read out a series of little poems that started to come out of me because of this experience. And every night I would be working at the shelter from, say, 6 p.m. to about 11. For 3-4 years, I did it constantly, continuously. And so I did a lot of writing at that time on this theme of homelessness. I'll read 2 of them. The first one goes this way. Sabji, said the boy from Badaयूं, teach me to write a letter that my old ma can read. She never went to school, Sabji. And remember, I won't learn to write what she can't read. This is yet another one that I'll read. This is, dreams are to be dreamt in sleep. To die when the eyes open, deny them, dismiss them, for the green pastures are nowhere. Dreams sink like paper boats when belief sits in them. Each day, I must work, I must earn and eat, just so that I go home. But that too is a dream, I confess.
Thank you. Very touching.
Thank you.
Paramita, you know, there's so much to say about you and your background, with your mother as a poet and you yourself being one and growing up with books. But from that momentum of poetry, I would like to go straight to your poetry and ask you to share some of it with us, in Odia as well as in English.
The title of the poem is My Sari. I basically wrote it in Odia and been translated by Jayanta Mahapatra. 5.5 ମିଟର ମର୍ଯ୍ୟାଦାରେ ମୁଁ ନିଜକୁ ଗୁଡ଼େଇ ଦେଇଛି ଓ ନିଜ ମହିମାରେ ନିଜେ ଘାରି ହେଉଛି। This is the Odia. Then let me start in my sari. Here, I wrap myself in a 5-yard long respectability and bask in my own glory. I don't remember if I had begged for this glory with folded hands, or had it been roughly thrust on me, or it was the hesitant maiden gift of a dreamy-eyed youth. The other day, my sisters were vainly boasting of their easy, comfortable clothes in the geometry of simple words. But I had kept silent. How could I have explained to them that my robes were divinely ordained? I returned home that night, shredded the sari to pieces, and chanting a mantra for each single one, consigned them to the wind. One piece was to provide a patch for the torn skirt of the rat-picker woman, another to cover up the naked, mutilated body of the woman raped and discarded in the village grove, one more for the bunce ward of the government hospital to cover bed number 10 on which lay the bride who could not get enough dowry, and last of all, to be stitched to the skimpy top of the barmaid serving drinks to half a dozen customers in the 5-star hotel. In the morning, I found all the pieces back. All the pieces back joined in a conspiracy to engulf me again. But yet, bits of my back, waist and breast are left bare, which even this 5-yard sari is unable to hide. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Very powerful images. I want Paramita to share with us why she was drawn to poetry when the bulk of her work is as a short story writer and as a novelist.
Renuka, as I had shared with you, my mother is a very important poet. I am very proud of her. And
Pratibha Satpathy ji.
And I had been watching since childhood, naturally, and I was always in awe. And that time in Odisha, poets were regarded very high. Jayanta Mahapatra, Ramakant Rath, Sitakant Mahapatra, J.P. Das, that little elder to my mother, but they were all regarded so high. Poetry was abundantly published in Odia, and there was readings everywhere. In my house, I had grown up as a child, been supplying them samosas and tea while they would be reading poetry, which I would not be understanding much at that point of time.
It's a Landu Jaydev in any case.
I would say it's, kind of 70s, mid-70s when I was a young girl. At that time, the modern poetry has already crept into Odia. So I was not able to understand much, but I loved the rhythm, the flow, the glare in their faces and the way they glow when they have been writing and then discussing and reading. So I also started with writing few poems, and then not because I couldn't give a competition to my mother, but somehow I got attracted to prose, like short fiction and novel writing. But still then, poetry is always a darling with me. I have but one book in poetry, but whenever poetry comes to me, sitting down with a paper and jotting it down, so this is still my first love.
Thank you for that. What a vivid picture you painted of the literary circle and the atmosphere. Was this in Cuttack, Bhubaneswar? Where was this?
Both
places.
in Cuttack, Bhubaneswar, but in the periphery also.
I
there
see.
Was maybe modern poetry came a little later to those parts, but there was poetry reading everywhere. Yes.
I see. It sounds a very lively scenario.
Absolutely.
And you were lucky to be part of it, right in the middle of things.
Mm-hmm.
Which leads me to ask you, Ravi, overall in the country, where is the poetry happening, according to you?
Well, again, in English, for a long time, it was Bombay. That was the vibrant place because there was a very remarkable community of poets. They got together. Well, I won't say it was a kind of a club of people who were always together with each other, but I think poetry was what they were committed to, and that's what brought them together, and that created the atmosphere for it. And then there were mentors like Nissim who helped younger poets, Dom, Nissim more than Dom, but there were these great names. Now, I think it happens everywhere. It isn't always good poetry. There's a lot of bad poetry. Well, I suppose historically, because people think that, it's, funnily enough, poetry requires a lot of discipline, more discipline probably than other forms of writing. But what happens is that, those who are lazy take to poetry because it's easy. Blank verse especially gives you that freedom to do what you like. And one region that interested me a lot, and because I was traveling there once for a period for about 4 or 5 years, was the northeastern areas of India, and that's where I think still more poetry is written than perhaps in any other similar region.
Really?
And a lot of it is good poetry too, a proportion of what's written overall. So, and it's interesting because there in poetry and also in prose, when I hear poetry, read poetry written in English there is a certain sensibility which isn't entirely urban, which isn't cut off from the realities of people who aren't of your own class, which tends to happen in English, which is not a bad thing. You write from experience, so, at least there's great authenticity there. But there isn't this distance between, let's say, even a rural and an urban kind of experience in the writing in the Northeast. And also, like other conflict areas, that's one reason, I think, why a lot of poetry is written, not only in English, but also in the other languages there. Because, intensity probably easier to convey in poetry, and also concealment is possible. That's, I think, also the reason for a lot of good poetry that emerges. And as Sukrita was saying earlier when we were speaking, there's a history or tradition of a lot of oral literature there. So that's probably another reason.
Well, I would say there's oral traditions coming in from all over India, as you made the point that your Hindi, Punjabi and Urdu personas were behind the English. And in your case too, it went from Odia into English. I've noticed that regional rhythms are very interesting from across the country. For instance, in Tamil poetry, from the Sangam era to now, there's a particular trick they have. It's called assonance, where the first 2 syllables rhyme. The starting syllables rhyme, not the end syllables like in rhyme. If I were to pick up a random example, Ishayada yenninum yeriyor aral, Ashayada nirpadam an main. This is old Tamil, and I won't trouble you all with the meaning now, it's just to give you a sense of the sound. Ishayada yenninum, it cuts off. Ashayada, the first syllables rhyme, and that's called assonance. And this is a party trick very particular to Tamil poetry, and I haven't come across it anywhere else. And there are informal poetry groups like Soul Flash Poems in Madras who write a lot of poetry and share it widely on social media. And there are people who translate a Tamil poem a day from people of different religious and cultural backgrounds. And there is a sense of great questioning, a sense of great deep observation, and very nuanced and sensitive reactions and responses to what's happening in India, good or bad. And it's not only conflict poetry, it's questioning poetry, it's observation poetry, it's also appreciation poetry. All the navras come into it, I think, all the shades and emotions. And what would be wonderful, Ravi, I'm asking you this as a publisher, is if you got poems from different parts of India into an anthology with a little note about their particular rhythms, like we got a sense of Odia from Paramita.
Oh, absolutely.
It would be so wonderful.
It is. But can I...
yes, please.
You see, if you look at, say, Aga Shahid Ali, quite an iconic writer, who he was my colleague, and we used to travel by the university special together. On the way, he would be singing all the time, and that would be classical music. And then suddenly he would burst out into a ghazal, right? And a ghazal which would then eventually got actually translated. Not translated, but
created.
It got created. It got just created in English. So he made it very popular, the whole idea of ghazal in English, right? Now when he's doing that, and now there are many of, including Mars, for instance, a young poet who's also doing that, and there are many others who are writing ghazals in English. So what is it that they are trying to do? And there are couplets like dohas being written. In Punjabi that is happening, right? In Hindi, chopaiyan, here and there. But of course the overall thing is that it is blank verse, But these rhythms of, I'm talking about poetry in English.
Rhythms of regional languages.
Of regional languages, they're getting negotiated.
Mm.
And the purists may not like it. Because
who are the purists anyway?
I don't think there are any
Are there any purists?
No,
I don't think there are any.
No, I'm not talking about
Not
English.
in the century of blank verse.
But look, in Hindi, a Hindi critic is going to criticize
Really?
an English poem. Yes, if we say this is written in the form of a doha or something. So basically, all I'm trying to say is that it may be happening by some pundits of sorts. But in the world of literature, in the world of creativity, these things are happening. It's a very, very healthy sign. And so what you said about, all of this coming together in an anthology, it would be absolutely great. Because I think there, not only do you get a glimpse, in English particularly, not only do you get a glimpse of what is in the original so-called sensibility, Punjabi or Tamil or whichever, but also amongst Tamil and Punjabi, amongst, Urdu and Gujarati. I saw a lot of that happening in Maharashtra, in Aurangabad, for instance, because there were a lot of Marathi writers and there were a lot of Urdu writers.
So basically the regional languages are in better shape when it comes to poetry than the English language.
There's no doubt about that. Absolutely, there is, because there is a vibrant publishing culture also.
Regional culture.
Yeah, there's a lot of poetry that is published, at least I know in Hindi.
The reading and citing
yes.
culture is also there.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was going to ask you about that, Paramita, that, is there a strong publishing culture of poetry in Odia? That still continues from what you just described a little earlier.
Actually, as Ravi has said, good books. Pardon me for saying that. He also said that everybody is thinking that it's an easy thing. It's a blank paper and you have just carry words from everywhere and put it, and it's easier that to, any impulse you get, anything you get in your mind and then write it. So in that way, a lot of poetry is being written, but books which are good, they are still a name in regional language, at least in Odia, because all the original literature started from poetry everywhere in the world, for that matter. So, there is a tradition of writing poetry,
in India particularly.
And then the prose and stories and novels, and they have come later to the picture. So, in Odia, they publish poetry, but, if the book is good,
it picks up.
It picks up, and it picks up much better, in a very good way. So, that is happening. But lot of other books are being published, people are publishing, self-publishings are being done. Whoever writes whatever things that are, let me put it in the market. Maybe that is the reason why that attraction towards poetry has come down.
Self-indulgence.
Yeah, can I just briefly say one thing is that, what sometimes, and it surprises me, I'm very pleasantly surprised, is that people, it's fashionable to say, poetry, I don't understand poetry. Sensitive people who read a lot also say it. It's just become, fashionable to say it sometimes. But there are others also who genuinely feel intimidated, but somehow, if you get them to read, or if they find something and they start reading and they connect with it, and then they're startled and they respond to poetry. So I don't know what it is that needs to be done to kind of, encourage more people to read it as something which is not an esoteric art, which needn't be intimidating, which is not like classical, music, or, for instance, if it's people who love film music, but the Hindustani or even Carnatic from which it is derived, they don't read that. So that kind of aura about poetry needs to go away, I think, which, as you said, there are lots of these spoken poetry festivals, etc. A lot of that is happening. So maybe that will create a greater climate.
I wanted to ask you, Ravi, here at this point, about the general breakdown in form that's happened historically. From, as Sukrita was saying earlier to us, from the early 20th century down the line worldwide. Do you think this has impacted condition of Indian poetry, in English particularly, and in the languages too, today?
Well, I can't remember the last time I read something which had rhyme, rhythm, meter of a very traditional classical sense, which was good. Quite frankly, which I even responded to. The poetry that even, Indian poetry in English, and also international poetry, which to me now makes the greatest sense, or which I respond to most, has moved away from all of that. And yet it is poetry.
There's just inner structure.
There isn't any of this, but it is poetry, you can tell.
Yeah, I think I quite agree with you, Ravi, but there is a sense of somewhere, that's why you respond to it. There is an intrinsic, within the poem, which is not so visible, but there is a sense of rhythm somewhere.
You were
of
going
meaning.
to say this.
Everything cannot be poetry if you are words, but there is a rhythm. And, catching it is a little difficult thing. I admit that it's easier to read a story, like or dislike it, but not easy to read a poem. You have to read it 2-3 times, read it with somebody, or listen to from somebody, mostly from the poet. Once you have to.
I don't know if you...
I beg your pardon, please go ahead.
I don't know if you would agree with me, but I think I'm an academic, but I'm saying this very clearly, that I think somewhere we, the academics, have failed in the context of appreciation of poetry, to work out how to appreciate poetry. How do you do it in the classroom? How do you bring up a whole generation after generation is exposed to this kind of poetry? It's like, modern art. Everybody says, oh, this is modern art. I can't understand it, because there hasn't been adequate exposure to that. Similarly to poetry, somewhere I think we haven't taken poetry into the classroom the way, modern poetry is what I'm talking about, the way we should have, because we stopped, particularly in English, I don't know if it's happening to all languages, we stopped looking at poetry after T.S. Eliot or something like that for a long time. Only now we are beginning to.
So do you think, Paramita, that there are lonely men in shirt sleeves hanging out of windows in the Indian countryside and in the urban areas who are waiting to be, nuanced and conveyed?
I agree with what taking cue from Sukrita, since my parents were professors and I had seen and gone through very intense discussion on poetry. Yeah. This is what happened generally, and I remember in the class when I was in +2, had a very good English professor, and he was teaching us a poem of Ramakandrat. Then the title is Chitra Pratima. Then I got into an argument. She said that is on Srima. I said, why? I mean, those things it's not that I was a young person. I don't know how much I understood, but there should be a dialogue. The way it is to be made popular. Definitely, it's not an easy read now, because it is no longer as sing-song like it was before. But there is a rhythm.
There's a rhythm.
Yes.
Well, thank you for that. I would like to give the last word to Ravi as a summary on where you see this could possibly go.
Well, I think I'm not pessimistic. I think it will be good. But, the only thing I'd like to point out is we're talking about form, etc. But its content and the sensitivity and the sensibility, I think that is more important, and which will sustain poetry when you have societies which are culturally impoverished, because you're not a sensitive society anymore. You're not going to have good poetry. So maybe that's what we are going through, the phase. And, you can have military poetry, jingoistic poetry, which is what is
It's
popular.
called Veer Rasa in Hindi.
Yeah, it is called Veer Rasa, but I think a little less of that would do as good, and a little less of confessional poetry would do as good. I think just, a sensitive society, once we become that, I think we'll have good poetry.
Poetry there is mystery in that. Some part of it will not perish because it's unfathomable. As long as mystery is there, you can't just starting with 2-3 lines, you can't understand what is it about.
Also, when you have, what is this, how is this going to be useful to me to get a job and all, maybe it will be, try it, but if that is all that you're looking at, then it's not just poetry, then, what literature can there be?
So basically poetry is something we read for our enjoyment, our enlightenment, and to feel something. And I think on that optimistic note, I'd like to thank you all so much for today's discussion and wish you all a very pleasant evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
You were listening to our panel discussion entitled The Art of Poetry in our national program of talks tonight. The panelists were Ms. Sukrita Paul Kumar, well-known poet, writer and academician; Ms. Paramita Satpathy, administrator, poet and Sahitya Academy awardee; Mr. Ravi Singh, acclaimed publisher; and Renuka Narayanan, writer and columnist, who initiated and moderated the discussion. Produced and presented by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio Delhi, this program came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.